William Burke and William Hare are the most famous grave robbers to never actually rob a single grave. It is a peculiar kind of historical branding. We remember them as the ghouls of the night, prowling through Edinburgh's kirkyards with shovels and lanterns to disturb the peaceful slumber of the recently departed. In reality, they found the labor of digging up heavy wooden coffins under the constant threat of being shot by cemetery guards to be far too much effort for two men with a taste for whiskey and a desperate need for cash. They realized that the free market had created a bizarre loophole, where a human being was worth absolutely nothing while drawing breath, but became a high-value commodity the moment they stopped. Instead of digging up the dead, they simply decided to create their own supply from the living, proving that in the early 19th century, murder was just a more efficient way to service the medical industry. To understand how two Irish immigrants turned a lodging house into a production line for the University of Edinburgh's anatomy department, you have to look at the system that made them. Edinburgh was the undisputed heavyweight champion of anatomical study in Europe, a city where surgeons were treated like rock stars and students flocked by the hundreds to watch a man in a bloody apron take apart the human machine. But there was a bottleneck in the supply chain. The law stated that medical schools could only legally dissect the bodies of executed criminals, suicide victims, or unclaimed orphans. By the 1820s, the number of people being hanged was dropping, but the number of students wanting to see what was inside. This was a classic supply and demand crisis, and when the law refuses to move, the black market happily steps in to provide the logistics. Enter the resurrection men, the actual grave robbers who made a decent living, dragging corpses out of the dirt. The public, quite understandably, hated this. Families started hiring armed guards to watch over graves. They built massive stone watchtowers in cemeteries like Dalkeith and Greyfriars. They invented the mort safe, a heavy iron cage that acted like a security vault for your grandmother's coffin, until she had decomposed enough to be of no use to a scientist. These security measures worked so well that they created a corpse famine in the city's medical schools. The price of a fresh subject skyrocketed to as much as £10 in the winter, which, for a laborer like William Burke, who might earn £1 a week on a good run, was a life-changing sum of money. William Burke and William Hare weren't born monsters. They were just two men who moved to Scotland to work on the Union Canal and found themselves living in the squalor of Edinburgh's West Port. Burke was a cobbler by trade, a man known for being industrious and even good-humored, often dancing on doorsteps to entertain his customers. Hare was the more volatile of the two, an illiterate man described as uncouth and violent, who lived with a woman named Margaret Laird in a tenement in Tanner's Close. Together with Burke's mistress, Helen MacDougall, the four of them inhabited a world of hard drinking and boisterous behavior, in a neighborhood where life was cheap, and the law was often just a distant rumor. The business plan fell into their laps by accident in November 1827. An old army pensioner named Donald, who lodged at Hare's house, died of dropsy. He died just before his quarterly pension came in, leaving Hare with a £4 hole in his pocket for back rent. Hare was furious that the old man had the audacity to die while still owing money. When a carpenter arrived with a parish-funded coffin, the two men saw an opportunity for a refund. They waited for the carpenter to leave, pried open the lid, hauled Donald's body out, and stuffed the coffin with tanning bark to match the weight. After dark, they hauled the corpse toward the university. They originally looked for Professor Alexander Monroe, but a student directed them to Surgeon Square, specifically the premises of Dr. Robert Knox. Knox was a flamboyant teacher with a scarred face, one blind eye, and a reputation for giving the most vivid demonstrations in the city. He was so popular that he lectured to over 400 pupils twice a day. When the two laborers showed up with a dead pensioner, Knox didn't ask for a death certificate or a receipt. He simply looked at the body and paid them £7 and 10 pence. As they were leaving, one of Knox's assistants made a comment that would change everything. He told them the doctors would be glad to see them again when they had another body to dispose of. The system had just given two desperate men a very dangerous incentive. They had earned nearly 2 months' wages for a single night of work, and they didn't even have to dig a hole. It was at this moment that they stopped being opportunists and became entrepreneurs of the macabre. They just needed more inventory, and they were too impatient to wait for the next lodger to die of natural causes. The first murder happened in early 1828. A miller named Joseph was staying at the house and came down with a fever. Margaret Laird and William Hare were worried that a sick lodger would scare off the other paying guests. Instead of calling a doctor, they called for William Burke. They plied Joseph with whiskey until he was nearly unconscious. Then, they invented a technique that was so effective. It eventually earned its own entry in the dictionary burking. Hare would hold his hand over the victim's nose and mouth to stop the breath, while Burke, a man of significant weight, would lie across the victim's chest to prevent the lungs from expanding. It was a brilliant, terrifying innovation. It left no marks on the body, no signs of a struggle, and no forensic evidence that could be detected by the medical science of the 1820s. To a doctor like Robert Knox, these weren't murder victims. They were just remarkably fresh subjects for the table. For Joseph the miller, the two men received £10. The profit margin on murder was officially higher than the profit margin on natural death. This was the start of a 10-month killing spree that claimed at least 16 lives. They began luring the vulnerable, the people whom nobody missed because nobody wished to see them again, as Sir Walter Scott later coldly observed. They targeted Abigail Simpson, a pensioner who sold salt. They got her so drunk she couldn't walk, smothered her, and stuffed her into a tea chest. Knox was so impressed by the quality of the body that he didn't even bother to ask why a healthy salt seller had suddenly dropped dead in the middle of a business trip. They moved on to an unnamed English salesman with jaundice, then an old woman who Margaret Laird lured into the house and plied with whiskey until she fell asleep. The deaths became routine. In April, Burke met two young women, Mary Patterson and Janet Brown, in a tavern. He bought them bottles of whiskey and invited them for breakfast. Janet Brown was lucky enough to leave after a domestic argument broke out between Burke and Helen McDougall. When she came back to look for her friend, Mary Patterson was already dead and on her way to Knox's surgery. There is a particularly haunting detail about Mary Patterson's death. When the body arrived, it was still warm. One of Knox's assistants thought he recognized her, but Burke simply lied and said she had drunk herself to death. Knox was so delighted with the specimen that he preserved her body in a barrel of whiskey for 3 months before dissecting it. The professional detachment of the medical establishment acted as a perfect shield for the killers. As long as the supply was steady and the quality was high, the why didn't seem to matter. The murders grew increasingly brazen and, frankly, absurdly cruel. They killed Mrs. Haldane, then killed her daughter Peggy a few months later when she came looking for her mother. They killed a cinder gatherer named Effie for £10. They even killed an old woman and her grandson, who was deaf and could not speak. Burke later confessed that the boy's murder haunted him the most, but that didn't stop them from forcing the two bodies into a herring barrel, because their usual tea chest was too small. When the horse pulling the cart refused to go any further, perhaps the only creature in Edinburgh with a working moral compass, they just hired a porter with a handcart to finish the job. Hare was so annoyed by the delay that he went home and shot the horse dead in his yard. Despite their success, the duo wasn't exactly a well-oiled machine. Burke and Hare were almost always intoxicated, with Burke later admitting he couldn't even sleep without a bottle of whiskey and a candle burning by his bed to keep the ghosts away. They fought over money. At one point, Burke suspected Hare and Margaret Laird were cutting him out of the profits, leading the two men to trade blows. Burke even moved out for a while. But the lure of easy money and the insatiable appetite of Dr. Knox eventually brought them back together. The end began with the murder of James Wilson, better known to everyone in Edinburgh as Daft Jamie. Jamie was an 18-year-old with a limp and a mental disability who was a fixture on the city streets. He was harmless and well-liked, and when he went missing, the city noticed. Hare lured him to the house with the promise of whiskey. But Jamie didn't like whiskey. He preferred snuff. He was stronger than their previous victims and fought back desperately against Burke and Hare, but he was eventually overpowered. When Jamie's body arrived at the surgery, the students recognized him immediately. The gossip in the lecture hall became deafening. Knox, ever the professional, denied it was him and moved Jamie to the front of the line for dissection. He removed the head and the deformed feet first to hide the identity of the subject. It was a move of calculated desperation from a man who knew exactly what he was buying. The final mistake occurred on Halloween night, 1828. Burke invited a middle-aged Irishwoman named Margaret Docherty into the house, claiming they were distant relatives. To clear the room for the murder, Burke paid his regular lodgers, Anne and James Gray, to stay at Hare's place for the night. The next morning, the Grays returned and noticed Burke acting strangely. He wouldn't let Anne Gray near the bed to get her stockings. When they were finally left alone in the room, they searched the straw at the foot of the bed and found Margaret Docherty's body. Helen McDougall tried to bribe the Greys with an offer of £10 a week to keep them quiet, but the Greys were among the few people in this story who couldn't be bought. They went straight to the police. By the time the authorities arrived, the body was gone, but they found Doherty's blood-stained clothes under the bed. When the police tracked the body to Knox's rooms, the game was finally up. Burke, Hare, and their wives were all arrested. This is where the story shifts from a horror movie to a legal farce. The police knew they had murderers, but they didn't have enough forensic evidence to prove it. The bodies had been systematically destroyed by Knox's scalpels. So the Lord Advocate, Sir William Ray, decided to play the villains against each other. He offered William Hare immunity from prosecution if he would turn King's evidence and testify against Burke Hare, showing the same loyalty he had shown to his victims. Readily agreed. He confessed to all 16 murders just to save his own neck. The trial began on Christmas Eve, 1828, and it was the hottest ticket in town. People paid as much as 20 shillings just for a window seat to watch the crowd. Hare took the stand and coolly pinned the actual killings on Burke. Margaret Laird also testified, using her baby's whooping cough fits to give herself time to think of lies when the questions got too difficult. In the end, the jury found Burke guilty of one murder, that of Margaret Doherty. The case against his wife, Helen McDougall, was found not proven, a uniquely Scottish verdict that essentially means, we know you did it, but we can't prove it. Burke was sentenced to death by hanging, followed by public dissection. The judge, David Boyle, even expressed a hope that his skeleton would be preserved so that posterity could remember his crimes. On January 28, 1829, 25,000 people showed up to watch Burke die. The irony was thick. The man who made a living providing bodies for science was now going to provide his own. The aftermath was just as grimly theatrical. Professor Alexander Munro, Knox's rival, performed the dissection in front of a riotous crowd of students. He even dipped his quill pen into Burke's blood to write a note commemorating the event. Parts of Burke's skin were tanned and used to bind a pocketbook, and his skeleton was put on display in the Anatomical Museum, where it remains to this day. William Hare was released in disguise and told to run for the English border. Legend says he was thrown into a lime pit and blinded by a mob, ending his days as a beggar in London. But no one actually knows what happened to him. Margaret Laird and Helen McDougall both fled the city, chased by angry mobs, and disappeared into history. And then there was Robert Knox. The man who financed the whole operation was never charged. A committee of inquiry cleared him of any legal wrongdoing, essentially deciding that he was just a very uncurious businessman. But the public didn't buy it. They burned him in effigy and hounded him until he was forced to resign. He eventually left Edinburgh and died in London, working as a pathologist for a cancer hospital. The real villain wasn't just Burke or Hare or even Knox. It was the law. The system had created a market where human remains were more valuable than human lives, and then acted surprised when someone decided to harvest the crop. In 1832, Parliament finally caught up and passed the Anatomy Act. It allowed surgeons to legally use the bodies of people who died in workhouses if they were unclaimed after 48 hours. It effectively killed the trade of the resurrection men by removing the profit motive that made murder such an attractive career path. Burke and Hare are remembered as grave robbers because that is a story we find easy to categorize creepy men in the mud. But the truth is much darker. They were the logical conclusion of a state-sanctioned shortage. They didn't rob graves. They simply followed the money that the law had left on the table. Looking at how the system eventually fixed the problem by taking the bodies of the poor from workhouses, do you think the Anatomy Act of 1832 was a genuine solution? Or did it just find a more polite way for the state to claim the bodies of the vulnerable?